I led worship in a 600-seat sanctuary for 22 years. I held the offering plate. I managed the budget. I stood at the front some Sundays in a suit my wife pressed the night before, and I believed, all the way down to the bone, that what we were doing was exactly what the apostles did. Word for word, practice for practice. I taught that to Sunday school classes for 2 decades, and about 4 months ago, I found out I was wrong. Not wrong about God, wrong about church. And here is the part I still have not fully made peace with. This is not a story about what I found. It is a story about what I had to hand back. Before I go further into this, if the kind of thing that keeps you up at 3 in the morning is exactly this kind of discovery, hitting subscribe tells the algorithm to send you more of these conversations. Because I have so many more of these that will not leave me alone. And this channel exists for exactly that. The conversations we rarely have out loud. Now, here's the thing. I need to start with a question somebody asked me once at a men's breakfast years ago that I did not have an answer for. He said, "Howard, if you had to walk into a room in the year 80, the first year of the church, and you had never seen a Sunday service before in your life, would you recognize it?" I laughed. "Of course I would recognize it," I said. "It is church. It has always been church." I did not think about that question again for almost 30 years. I taught American history for 35 years at the same high school. I taught my students to compare a primary source to the story that got told about it later. Always compare the document to the legend. I taught that every single September to a fresh set of 16-year-olds. And I never once turned that method on my own Sunday morning. Not once. Not until I retired. Not until my wife passed and the house got quiet enough that I could hear myself think. It was the quiet that did it, if I am honest. After she was gone, I did not know what to do with my hands on a Sunday. She used to hold my hand during the second hymn. I would open my Bible, a leather one, gold-edged pages, her name and mine written on the inside cover from our wedding, and I would follow along. And I felt like I was standing in an unbroken line of people going all the way back to Peter and Paul, all the way back to the upper room. That was the story I told myself for 50 years, an unbroken line. So, one Sunday, sitting in the third pew from the front, in a building that seats 600 people, empty except for me and the custodian vacuuming somewhere behind the baptistry, I looked up at the cross on the wall, 12 feet tall, carved oak, and I had this thought I could not shake. Where did that come from? Not the wood, the idea. When did we start putting the execution device on the wall and call it worship? I did not have an answer, and I could not sleep that night until I went looking for one. I want you to understand what an empty 600-seat sanctuary sounds like, because that sound is where this whole thing started. It is not silence. It is a kind of pressure. The building was designed to hold the noise of hundreds of voices, the organ, the choir loft behind the pulpit. And when it is just you in the third pew, that same architecture presses back on you with everything it was built to carry and does not have to carry anymore. My wife used to say the building felt alive on Sunday morning and asleep the rest of the week. After she passed, I started going in on Tuesday afternoons when the office staff had already gone home, just to sit. I could not have told you why. I think I was looking for her in a room that used to be full of her. What I found instead, sitting in that particular kind of quiet, was a question I could not silence. I need you to hear this. I thought I was going somewhere for one answer. I got 100 I was not ready for. I want to be honest about what I expected to find because it tells you something about how deep this goes. I expected an older, rougher version of us, a smaller building, fewer instruments, maybe robes instead of suits. But the shape, I assumed, would be the same. Somebody standing at the front. A sermon, a structure, an order of service, even if it was primitive. I was looking for the seed of the tree I had spent 22 years pruning. That is what I told myself I would find. So I went to the public library in Knoxville, the same one where, years earlier, a used copy of Spinoza's Tractatus had cracked something open in me for the first time, taught me that a document has a history, that a book was written by a person, in a place, for a reason, and that reason can be traced. I checked out everything I could find on the first 2 centuries of the early church, and there was one document that kept getting footnoted over and over in book after book, a text called the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, written somewhere between the year 50 and the year 120, which means parts of it may be older than some of the letters in my own New Testament. I had never heard the name in 22 years as a deacon. Not once. Not in a sermon. Not in a Sunday school curriculum. Not in a single leadership training seminar. I need to explain something about myself here, because it matters for what happened next. 35 years in a classroom teaches you a very specific reflex. Every fall, I stood in front of a new group of 16-year-olds, and I taught them the same lesson before we touched a single date or a single battle. I taught them that the story people tell about an event and the actual documents from that event are 2 different animals, and you have to force yourself to read the documents first before you let the story back into the room. I graded thousands of essays where a student would quote a textbook's summary of the Declaration of Independence instead of reading the actual document, and I would write the same note in red ink every time. Go to the source. So, when I finally sat down with the Didache, I made myself do what I had told teenagers to do for 3.5 decades. I did not let myself read a single modern commentary first. I read the primary text cold, the way I would have made a student read it. Before anyone got to tell me what it meant, I opened it at my kitchen table around 11 at night. I remember the time because I looked at the clock right before, and I looked at it again 4 hours later, and I did not remember what happened to the time in between. There was no cross on the wall in that document. There was no printed Bible in anyone's hands, because there was no printed Bible yet. Not for another 300 years. There was no man in robes standing at a podium. There was no podium. There was no building fund, no capital campaign, no architectural committee arguing over carpet samples, which, for the record, is a real meeting I sat through in 1994 for 11 months. There was nothing in that document that looked like the 22 years of my life. Stay with me on this, because I almost stopped reading right there. It was late. I told myself I would finish the chapter and go to bed, but something kept me at that table. What the Didache described instead was almost embarrassingly simple. Believers gathering on the Lord's Day, breaking bread together, sharing what it calls an agape, a love feast, an actual meal in an actual home among people who knew each other's names and each other's debts and each other's children. There was no career clergy. There were traveling teachers, itinerant apostles and prophets who moved from town to town, and the Didache is almost suspicious of them. It says test them. It says if a prophet asks for money for himself, he is a false prophet. Send him away. I sat with that line for a long time, because I thought about every capital campaign I helped run, every pledge card, every brass offering plate, which I personally helped select from a catalog in 2003. We argued about the finish, brushed or polished, for almost a full board meeting. And the local leaders in this document, the overseers and the servants, what later got called bishops and deacons, my own title, the very word I wore for 22 years, they were chosen by the community itself. By consensus, ordinary people, tested by how they lived, not by seminary credentials, not by ordination papers, not by a denominational board. It was not a hierarchy handed down from on high. It was an arrangement of mutual accountability among equals, and the ones who served did not stand above the ones they served. I want to be honest. Something in me tried to fight this. I am a details man. 35 years grading essays taught me to look for the counter-argument before I trust my own read. So I told myself, this is a persecuted minority meeting in secret. Of course it looks small. Of course it looks like a living room and not a cathedral. They were hiding from Rome. The moment they got the chance, they would have built exactly what I grew up in. Necessity, not conviction. That was my out. I held on to that explanation for almost 2 weeks like a man holding a rope. But no, that is not quite right. Let me back up, because the way I just said that makes it sound like a clean decision, and it was not. What actually happened is I needed that explanation to be true, because if the house churches were just a temporary phase waiting to become my 600-seat sanctuary, then I was not a man who had drifted from something. I was the fulfillment of it, the hero of the story, not a footnote to a version that got lost. I know what some of you are already thinking because I thought it myself for 2 weeks straight. Fair enough. Of course they met in secret, in houses, without hierarchy. They were a persecuted minority. Rome could execute you for this. Of course it looks small and quiet. That is not a statement about how church should be. That is just what hiding looks like. I want to give that argument its full weight, because it deserves it, and because I needed it to be true. Necessity absolutely shaped some of what I was reading. Nobody puts a 12-foot cross on a wall when soldiers are looking for you. But necessity does not explain everything in the Didache. It does not explain the test for a traveling prophet asking for money. A secret, hunted community does not need an ethics test for grifters. It needs silence. The fact that they built in a specific method for holding their own leaders accountable tells you they were not just hiding. They were governing themselves on purpose in a particular way, and that is a choice, not only a circumstance. Then I found a letter that took that rope out of my hands completely. It was written by a Roman governor named Pliny the Younger, around the year 112, to the Emperor Trajan himself. Pliny was not a believer. He was not sympathetic. He was the government, investigating a group he did not understand and, frankly, did not like. He tortured 2 enslaved women who served in these gatherings, trying to find the crime underneath it, trying to find the conspiracy. And here is what this hostile investigator reported back to Rome, in his own words, under his own authority, with nothing to gain by softening it. He wrote that they met before dawn on a fixed day, that they sang a hymn, antiphonally, back and forth, to Christ as if to a god, that they bound themselves by an oath, not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to break their word. And then, later in the day, they gathered again to share ordinary, harmless food. That is the entire report, from a man with a torture chamber and an incentive to find something damning. No altar in his account, no priest, no cross, no mention of a building at all. Just people, singing, promising to live honestly, and eating a meal together. The government's own paperwork calls it harmless, not because they were hiding their real practice from Pliny, because there was nothing else to hide. The simplicity was not a mask over something bigger. The simplicity was the whole thing. There is a version of this story where you decide these were just a secret cult performing strange rituals in the dark, and I understand why somebody might land there. Meeting before dawn, in private homes, binding each other by oath, it sounds like exactly the kind of thing you would warn your children about today. But that is not what an actual Roman investigator with actual torture at his disposal and actual authority from the emperor found when he looked directly into it. He found a hymn and a shared meal and a promise to be honest. If there had been anything sinister to report, a man like Pliny had every incentive in the world to report it. He did not, because there was nothing else there. I will admit something else here, because if I do not, this whole story sounds too clean, and it was not clean at all. There was a night, maybe 2.5 weeks into this, where I almost put the whole project down for good. I had found a third document by then, a longer one, written a generation after the Didache, by a man named Justin Martyr, describing a Sunday gathering with actual readings, an actual address from whoever was presiding, a formal prayer, a collection taken up for the poor. And for one evening, sitting there with 3 documents spread across my kitchen table instead of one, I felt almost relieved because this one looked a little more like what I knew. There was structure here. There was a shape I recognized. And some tired, hopeful part of me thought, there it is. That is the missing link. That is the bridge back to my sanctuary. Maybe I can stop now. I remember thinking, maybe this is close enough. Maybe I do not need to keep pulling this thread. I almost closed the laptop right there. It was late. I had a doctor's appointment in the morning, and some part of me wanted permission to stop digging and go back to feeling normal on a Sunday. But something nagged at me before I could let myself off the hook. If this more formal service was already a step away from the meal in the Didache, 1 generation later, then it was not proof my sanctuary was original. It was proof the drift had already started, and it had not stopped. It was a second draft, not a return to the first. That distinction kept me up longer than I want to admit. It is the difference between finding a rope back to shore and finding out you are further out to sea than you thought. I need to tell you what happened to me physically when I read that letter, because it is the part I still have not explained to anyone. I put the book down. I walked to my kitchen. I stood at the counter where my wife used to make coffee every morning for 38 years. And I did not cry exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you find out a friend has been dead for a while and nobody told you. A cold, delayed kind of grief for a version of the story I did not know I had already lost. And then came the piece that made the whole thing physical instead of just historical. In 1932, an archaeological team from Yale University and the French Academy, digging in a Roman border town in Syria called Dura-Europos, uncovered an ordinary private home that had been converted sometime around the year 233 into a space for Christian worship. It is the oldest identified Christian church building ever found. It survived because Roman military engineers, bracing for a Persian siege in the year 256, buried the entire district under a defensive earthen bank to reinforce the city wall. The dirt that was meant to stop an army ended up preserving the room perfectly for over 1,600 years. Inside, archaeologists found the oldest known Christian baptistery and some of the earliest Christian frescoes ever discovered. And it is a house, a converted living room, a side room adapted for baptisms. No steeple, no stone altar, no nave, no pews bolted to a floor. Just rooms where a family used to sleep and eat, opened up to a small community that gathered there instead. It was not a sacred building set apart from ordinary life. It was ordinary life, made sacred by who was in the room. I sat with a printout of that excavation photo for a long time. I kept comparing it, in my head, to the architectural rendering our building committee approved in 1991, the one with the vaulted ceiling and the pipe organ loft. 2 rooms, both called church. I could not make them into the same idea, no matter how long I stared. I want to slow down on that photograph for a second because it is the image that finally made all 3 documents click into one shape for me. It is just a floor plan, really, drawn by an archaeologist decades after the dig. A modest square footprint, a courtyard in the middle, the way houses in that part of the world were built, rooms opening onto the courtyard instead of onto a street. One room, slightly larger than the others, had benches built into the plaster along the walls. Low, simple, meant for maybe 30 people sitting close together, knee to knee. Another small room, off to the side, had a basin built into the floor, painted plaster around it showing the Good Shepherd carrying a lamb, one of the oldest images of Christ ever painted. That was the baptistery. That was the whole architecture of the earliest church we have ever physically found. A bench along a wall. A painted basin in a side room. I sat with that floor plan next to the blueprint of my own church's south wing, the one with the elevator we installed in 2009 for the wheelchair access, and something in me finally stopped arguing. There was no fortress in that floor plan. There was a house where people ate dinner on Tuesday and were baptized on Sunday in the same building, sometimes probably the same week. While I was pulling all of this together, cross-referencing the Didache against Pliny, against the Dura-Europos findings, I started organizing my notes into something usable, because I could not keep it straight in my own head anymore. That collection eventually became something I called the Spinoza Forever Library, 5 volumes of the primary documents and the historical through lines, the kind of material you were never handed in a Sunday bulletin. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to read the raw texts yourself instead of taking my word for any of it. I am not asking you to trust my summary. I'm asking you to go look. Here is where it stopped being research and started being a bill I had to pay. 22 years. I want to say that number again, because I need you to feel the weight of it the way I finally did. 22 years as a deacon. Budget meetings. Building maintenance. The order of service. Printed weekly. Laminated for the usher's binder. I thought I was guarding something ancient. Something unbroken. What I was actually managing, it turns out, was the end result of a very long, very human process of formalization that historians have actually mapped out in detail. Research on the period documents that early Christian worship grew directly out of the structure of the Jewish synagogue. Scripture reading, communal prayer, a shared meal, and that the buildings, the vestments, the ordained hierarchy, all of it, developed gradually over centuries, not from a founding blueprint. Justin Martyr's account, the one that almost gave me an excuse to stop looking, was already more structured than what came before it, which tells you the drift toward what I grew up in was not a single decision. It was 1,000 small ones, made by well-meaning people, one committee meeting at a time, for 200 years, until nobody left alive remembered the living room it started in. I do not know how to explain what that did to my sense of who I was without sounding dramatic, so I am just going to say it plainly. It is not that I was wrong about the New Testament. Believers argue about that constantly, and honestly, that argument does not interest me anymore. It is that I was wrong about who I had been for 22 years. I thought I was a guardian of the original faith. I was actually a very devoted middle manager of an institution that the apostles themselves would not have recognized if they walked through its doors. That is a strange, quiet kind of grief, small on the outside. Nobody at the grocery store can see it on my face. But it is enormous on the inside, and it rearranges something. Not what I believe about God, necessarily. What I believe about the 22 years I gave to a building. Now, here's the thing, nobody warns you about this part. You do not get to unlearn it. You just learn how to carry it differently. Let me give you the specific moment, because a feeling this big deserves a specific moment, and not just a summary. About 3 weeks into all this, I went to my granddaughter's baptism at my old church, the one I served for 22 years. Same sanctuary. Same 600 seats, maybe 200 of them filled that Sunday. The pastor held her, said the words, the choir sang, and the congregation watched from their pews the way you watch a performance, politely at a distance, in your good clothes. I sat in the 4th row, and for the first time in my life inside that building, I felt like a tourist in my own church. I kept picturing a room in Syria the size of my living room. 10 or 12 people, no pews, no distance, everyone close enough to touch the water. I was not angry at anyone in that room. I loved every person in it, but I could not find my way back into feeling what I used to feel. And I sat there through the whole service, smiling, holding my daughter-in-law's hand, grieving something I could not explain to a single person sitting next to me. Every single time I drive past a church now, and there is one on nearly every corner of this county, I do not see the living room in Dura-Europos anymore. I see a Roman basilica with a cross where the emperor's seal used to be. I see the distance between people passing a loaf of bread around a real table and a congregation watching a stage from row 40 under stadium lighting, following along on a screen. I see an institution that solved for crowd control what the first 2 centuries solved for intimacy. And I think about every argument I sat through on that deacon board, who was allowed to serve communion, who was allowed to speak from the pulpit, who had the authority to make decisions for 600 people, and I realize now we were enforcing rules that were written centuries after every person named in the Didache was already dead. We were guarding a fortress that had nothing to do with the house it was supposedly built to protect. Remember that question from the men's breakfast all those years ago? Would I recognize a first-century service if I walked into one? I laughed then. Of course I would. It is church. It has always been church. I am not laughing now. I would not recognize it at all. I would walk into that room in the year 80 looking for the front of the church, and there would not be one. I would look for the man in charge, and I would find a rotating group of neighbors who fed each other and tested a traveling teacher by whether or not he asked for cash. I would look for my leather-bound New Testament in someone's hands, and I would find the Hebrew Scriptures, read aloud, and a memory, still warm, still being passed mouth to mouth, of a man who ate with people the temple would not touch. I spent 22 years believing I was standing at the end of an unbroken line. What I actually found is that the line broke almost immediately, and what I inherited was the second, third, fourth draft, dressed up to look like the first. I want to be careful here, because this is not where I land, not really, and it took me a while to get to the part I actually want to leave you with. If you have ever sat in a service that felt enormous and somehow still lonely, if you have ever wondered why something that is supposed to be about a shared table ended up feeling like a performance you watch from your seat, there is a word for what you have been sensing. It is not that your church is doing something evil. It is that somewhere between a home in Syria and a sanctuary in Tennessee, we traded agape for architecture. We traded a meal for a program. And once you can name that trade, you cannot unsee it. But here is the part that surprised me. Naming it did not just take something from me. It gave something back too. Because underneath the grief, there was something else waiting that I was not expecting. A strange, quiet relief. If the earliest expression of this faith was not a building, not a hierarchy, not a printed book, not a man in robes, but 2 or 3 people sharing food and looking out for each other honestly, then whatever I'm doing now, sitting with a neighbor over coffee, being honest with a stranger in a comment section, telling you the truth about what it cost me to find this out, that might be closer to the original thing than the 600-seat sanctuary ever was. I spent 22 years thinking bigger meant truer. I am learning, slowly, that the opposite might be closer to it. Smaller, plainer, a table instead of a stage. If this channel has helped you put words to the grief and the confusion of leaving the religion you grew up in, or even just questioning the version you were handed, consider using the Super Thanks button below this video. I do this because someone has to say it out loud, and because a lot of people write to me saying they thought they were the only one who noticed the gap between the Sunday Bulletin and the actual history. Your support is what lets me keep digging through these documents and bringing them back here to share with you plainly, without the theological spin. You are not just watching this. You are part of the reason I keep going back to the library. I am not the man who sat in those deacon meetings arguing about carpet samples anymore. I cannot go back to being him. And some days, that is a loss I still feel in my chest. But I am also, for the first time in a long while, not pretending the story is simpler than it is. There is a word for what got lost between that Syrian living room and my Tennessee sanctuary. We lost the agape. We lost the table. We lost the plain, unglamorous intimacy of people who knew each other's names, feeding each other honestly. And there is also, if you are willing to sit with it, something quietly hopeful in knowing that the smallest version of this, the truest version, is still available to anyone with a table and a loaf of bread, and someone willing to sit down across from them. I keep thinking about that lesson I taught every September for 35 years. Go to the source. Compare the document to the legend. I spent 3.5 decades handing that method to teenagers like it was a tool for grading somebody else's history, the Founding Fathers, the Civil War, the treaties nobody reads past the first paragraph. It never once occurred to me that the method was a mirror, and that eventually I would have to hold it up to my own Sunday morning, to my own leather Bible, to my own 22 years at the front of a building I helped pay for. I taught the tool for other people's myths for so long that I almost missed the fact that I was standing inside one. If you want to read the Didache and Pliny's letter for yourself, without me standing between you and the page, the Spinoza Forever Library is linked in the description and in the pinned comment. Just the primary sources laid out plainly, so you can decide what they mean without anyone preaching at you about it, including me. I do not know where you are tonight. Maybe you are sitting in a pew this Sunday wondering why it feels hollow and you cannot say why. Maybe you left years ago and you are still carrying a version of the guilt I carried for 22 years without knowing its name. Maybe you have never set foot in a church at all, and none of this history means anything to you personally, except that it explains something about a spouse, or a parent, or a childhood you are still trying to make sense of. Either way, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments if you have ever sat in a massive service and felt, without being able to explain it, that something essential was missing from the room. I do not have a clean answer for you. But after 4 months in these documents, sitting at the same kitchen table where I once believed I understood exactly what Sunday morning was supposed to look like, I know this much for certain. We are not the only ones who ever asked the question. And whatever it costs you to ask it honestly, I promise you, it costs less than pretending you never wondered at all.